I mean, we know that 90% of adverse events go unreported. So why is that? And it's all those key elements, but it's so much more.
Hi, I'm Caitlin.
And I'm Clarinda. And this is Not Just Patients,
a podcast where we break barriers to meaningful patient involvement in healthcare.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Our guest on this episode is Stacy, and we're going to be talking about patient safety in clinical trials and medical practice.
Stacy is Chief Patient Officer at Parexel, where she leads efforts to embed the patient voice across clinical research and drug development. A patient, survivor, and caregiver herself, Stacy brings both professional expertise and lived experience to her work, advocating for more inclusive, patient-centered trials and meaningful engagement throughout the research journey. She is a widely respected leader and speaker dedicated to improving how research is designed, conducted, and experienced by patients worldwide. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stacy.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're very excited to have you. So I guess just to start with, it'd be great to get a little bit of context and background actually to your story and what's actually driving your motivation for championing patient safety.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I myself am a victim of both a diagnostic medical error and a surgical error. The diagnostic error was when I was diagnosed with colorectal cancer. One of the initial screenings was to get a CT scan. And unfortunately, the CT scan missed the cancer in my liver. So fortunately, I advocated to get a PET scan, which identified all the places in my body that had tumors, which I think was a total of 27 metastases across my body. But initially, like I said, they did a CT scan, missed my liver, which would have completely staged me differently. The course of my treatment would have been different. And so that was one thing that happened. But the bigger thing was the surgical error. And that was when I went in for my resection of my rectum and my liver. Unfortunately, the surgeon nicked a blood vessel and I lost half of my blood volume and almost died. Yeah, I coded, I went into cardiac arrest and almost died. And what was supposed to be kind of a routine resection turned into much more. So I woke up in the ICU and I saw a clock, so I knew I was alive. But, I asked my husband what happened and he told me. And the next thing that happened, I was on Dilaudid. So I don't know if you know Dilaudid, but it's a really powerful painkiller and I was not in my right mind. And somebody from the health system came in and basically asked me if I was going to sue them. I said, no, this is a marathon, not a sprint. I don't plan to sue, but I had to sign something, like, again, not in my right mind, to release them from liability. And I just thought to myself, this isn't good. This isn't the way it should be. This isn't cool. But, I did. And I remember following up afterwards. Let me say that I would go back to the surgeon tomorrow. I don't blame him. It was a combination of the chemo and my blood thinning and everything. But the head of surgical oncology said to me, anybody else would have sued us. And I said, well, I'm not everybody else. But with that being said, that happened. I didn't sue them. So what happened afterwards? Was that reported? What was changed as a result of that? That feedback loop wasn't closed for me. I don't know. I was never told. That's really my personal motivation for wanting to improve the system. It's always, something that kind of happened to me, as we're all shaped by our personal experiences. But that's what happened to me. And then, of course, I came to work in clinical research and clinical trials. And I remember speaking with a patient, and her name's Jessica. She's no longer with us, unfortunately. But, she told me some experiences about you have to be a well-behaved unicorn in clinical trials, that, you make one wrong move and you're kicked out of the clinical trial. This was how she felt. And that included reporting adverse events. It takes so much to get into these clinical trials. And then you're afraid that if you say something or you speak up for yourself, that you're going to be kicked out. Well, I don't want it to be that way. I don't want patients to feel that way. I want them to feel that they're a part of the process and that they can report what's happening to them to make it better.
Yeah.
That's how it
Yeah.
should be for all of us.
Yeah.
So all of that to say that World Patient Safety Day happens on my birthday, September
wow.
17th. So I feel like it is my destiny,
Oh, wow. We didn't even know that bit of trivia about your birthday and World Patient Safety Day when we invited you to speak on this topic, but it sounds like
it's big.
Yeah, I think that there's so much that goes into patient safety, but I don't think that any average person, whether they are in the industry or certainly not somebody who's out of the industry, would be able to define it, and definitely not have a shared definition. So since we're going to be spending the next hour or so talking about it, maybe we could just agree on some of the components of patient safety and what might be the different situations in which it comes into play.
Yeah, sure. I defer to the World Health Organization, and they, of course, are the global leaders in this area. And so I'm going to refer to their definition, which is the absence of preventable harm to a patient. That's really what it is. It is prevention of adverse events and response to adverse events and how we report those adverse events, no matter what they are. And I would say, again, textbook key elements of patient safety are communication, teamwork, trust, patient engagement, ongoing training, and technology integration. And I really think that, we can break those apart. But when you think about it, it really is all of those things that come together to improve the system. But if I can just be candid, we know that 90% of adverse events go unreported. So why is that? And it's all those key elements, but it's so much more. It's, you have a global podcast here. So it's cultural, it's systemic support, it's health literacy, patient education. I'm a little biased because of my son being nonverbal. It's accessibility. We can sit here and say, oh, reporting, get on a device or call a number. Okay, well, that's not so easy. It wouldn't be easy for somebody like my son, Emmett, who's nonverbal. It's not easy for somebody that has a language barrier. It's not easy to report through technology if you don't have connectivity in an underserved area, right? So it's taking into account a patient's entire support system. And does that make it easy for them to come forward with what's happening to them?
Yeah. Right. And just to make it even more specific and clear to any of our listeners who might not be familiar, how would we even define an adverse event? Would it be anything that's unexpected arising from a treatment, or do you have a definition for that as well?
Yeah, and let me also say that I am not a patient safety expert here, but I like talking about topics that are underserved themselves and need more explanation. So I can just give you sort of, how I view an adverse event. And again, I'm just going to speak from experience. And I think, Clarinda, you bring up an excellent point, because I don't think that it is really adequately defined, right? Because is this an accepted side effect of the medication, or is this something that's happening for my disease? If I'm in a clinical trial, it's all of those things. Is it disease progression? Is it an accepted side effect? Is it an adverse event that should not be happening because of the pharmacodynamics of how the medication is acting on the body? So I'm going to answer your question with, that's a good question. And it's tough to tell patients to trust your body and to trust your gut. And if you think something is wrong, to report it. And you hope that in a clinical trial situation that the site and the healthcare professionals and the investigators are explaining that adequately, that if something happens, to call this number, contact your study coordinator, your study nurse, etc. And so I think that's a good question. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the word adverse is a scary word because it's such an extreme word that it would make most people think that if this is not severe enough, it's not something I should bring up. and they would probably take it in their stride as, yeah, this is just something I need to deal with, So
Hmm.
unless that is communicated as something to watch out for. So if you get a stomach ache, no matter how mild, report it or let me know. Because if I get a stomach ache, I'm not going to say, oh, this might be an adverse event, right? I'm not going to call my doctor and say I have a stomach ache. So that's where it gets really tricky for a regular patient or anybody to know what might qualify. And patients would gaslight themselves, if I might use that term. But essentially, it's likely that they might say, oh, this is nothing, or people around them might say this is nothing, or the system might say this is nothing, even when they do think that actually, no, this is quite bad. This seems really sinister, and I actually want to get this checked. And then the system might say, actually, that's nothing. So I think that it's interesting that no one really understands exactly what that means, even working in the space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's on a trial by trial, case by case basis. And to your point, when we talk about communication and trust, what's the worst that can happen if you report it? It's nothing, right? It's a side effect. Okay. What's the best thing that can happen? That you have contributed to the path of research because you reported something that happened to you. You shaped research. And how great is that? That a patient was empowered to do that. But that comes through communication and trust, for sure.
Yeah.
I totally agree with all those components, and I'm desperately trying to hold my questions for later because I could send this off in so many different directions right now. This is already so interesting. But the one thing as well that I wonder, and again from your story, is if there needs to also just be like an element of that compassion and remembering that patients are people who we are ultimately trying to help and save, because I worry that patient safety, so obviously from a patient perspective, you want to be safe, but there's a lack of understanding and trust. But from a healthcare professional or a clinical researcher perspective, it almost sounds like it's gone to that point where they're scared of it. They don't want to hear about it because they're worried about getting sued, or they're worried about their trial failing, or they're worried about whatever it might be, that it might have a negative impact on them, and not actually almost prioritizing the patient. And that's what really struck me in your story when you were sort of in the hospital bed and they were asking you not to sue, and that seemed to be their main concern.
Well, exactly. I mean, operating in an environment of fear is not productive for anybody, and it doesn't protect anyone, and it doesn't preserve quality. It's not accurate data reporting. So yeah, how do we break down that barrier, number one, of fear and that stigma of fear? And, let's be honest, let's put on our hat of a pharmaceutical or a biotech company that if you're bringing a drug to market, and what is it, $1 million a day when you have a delay, and you're not meeting your milestones? I mean, that's real money there. Okay. So big respect for pharma and biotech companies who are bringing their drug to market. And of course, their compassion for wanting to bring a treatment and cure to a patient faster. That's what we're all here for too. So it's really these opposing factors, coming against each other, that we want to get this drug to market as quickly as possible for the patient to save money, let's be honest, but also understanding what are the risks and what is the preventable harm here, and how can we promote the best outcome for the patient. So a lot of competing factors. And honestly, I have empathy for all of them since I've been on all sides of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're going to discuss this lots more as we go through, but what might be great to sort of help with our understanding of exactly what the drivers and barriers are for patient safety is to understand a little bit about the different processes that are involved. So patient safety is obviously a key component, firstly, of the drug development process. So we've touched on that a little bit, and we're talking about clinical trials and research. And there are many steps and safeguards, protocols in place to ensure that the drugs that are reaching patients do meet certain standards of safety. So wondering if you could give us actually an overview of what that sort of pre-launch process looks like.
Well, yeah, again, I'm a big health literacy champion, and I want to be curious to our audience and understanding the drug development process. And so safety and tolerability of a drug is established in phase 1 of a clinical trial process. And we could kind of go through phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. But the actual testing of safety and tolerability of a drug happens in phase 1. And like I said, you're looking at the pharmacokinetics, the pharmacodynamics, how the drug's acting on the body, how the body's acting on the drug. That all happens in phase 1. But what I want our audience to know is that a phase 1 clinical trial for a healthy participant is much different than a phase 1 oncology trial. Okay. And I'll give you an example. So a phase 1 healthy participant would be something like a vaccine trial or a GLP-1 trial where you have healthy participants. But I'm a cancer survivor. So I talk to many cancer patients. They have gone through 1, 2, 3 lines of treatment and through standard of care. And they're going to go into what we call a first in human phase 1 clinical trial in oncology. Okay. And so this is their last chance. And they feel like, and we can unpack this more, but it's almost like you're a guinea pig. I still hear that term every single day. Every single day. I feel like a guinea
immediately came to mind. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
Guinea pig, research experiment. I'm a research experiment. I'm an experiment. I mean, those terms just completely break my heart. I mean, I can't even tell you. But can you imagine? I mean, this person is already completely beat up and beat down from their disease, beat up from probably surgeries and stents and infections, and they're going into a first in human trial. So I think it's my humble opinion that safety and those guardrails and that monitoring has to be even more ramped up in an oncology. I'm using oncology, but that could be changed out for rare disease too.
Yeah.
I mean, thinking about my son going into that and what I would expect, the level that I would expect. So that's, like I said, it all happens in phase 1. But with that being said, as anybody who follows me knows that I think that should come into place much earlier. I mean, pre-protocol, pre-phase 1. And this is why, and you'll both appreciate that, this is why we need to have patients involved looking at these protocols. I mean, very early on. Once it comes to protocol, it's too late. It's baked in. This is why we need patients looking at that much sooner, because if you have patients with the condition and they're advocates like us and they're talking to other patients, they can flag things and say, oh, wait a minute, hold on. I know that procedure is going to trigger that adverse event. What else can we do to still I preserve the reporting of the data and everything? But what can we substitute in there to keep a patient safer and preserve them from dropping out? I mean, adverse events are like one of the number 1 causes for dropout.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear, I guess what you're proposing is that actually patients are getting involved in designing what that phase 1 actually looks like, so that we can kind of ensure that, in a way, that phase 1 is something that's acceptable to that patient group.
100%. 100%. That's what I'm advocating for. And even in a perceived safe, let's talk about a GLP-1 trial. Okay. Why do patients drop out of GLP-1 trials? They're not losing weight. Patients participate in GLP-1 trials to lose weight. Okay. So they're not losing weight because perhaps they're in the placebo arm. So how do we keep them in the trial? How do we keep them engaged and also monitor their safety, which to me, and again, I mean, patient safety has such a broad definition. You could say patient safety in a GLP-1 trial is their overall health status. How do they feel? Do they have more energy? How do they feel psychologically? Let's bring in the psychological component of patient safety. How do they feel about themselves, their self-esteem, their perception of their bodies, their body image? That's an element of patient safety too. And what are we doing to give attention to that?
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I love the idea of, while we champion patient involvement at various phases of research, even folks who talk about patient involvement talk about it in boxes, and there are points at which patients can be involved. And for one, it doesn't happen everywhere and it doesn't happen in the way it should. as uniformly and globally and all of that. But where it happens as well, it happens in boxes. It's not like patients are part of the team. It's not like patients are just embedded, as it were. And what you're suggesting is so cool. The idea that why should patients not be involved pre-protocol design? Why should patients not be involved in phase 1, which is about safety? And, a researcher might say, oh, but the safety aspects are pure science. They don't need a patient's input at all. But you just gave some excellent examples of why a patient's input might be helpful at those stages as well. And yes, there are so many ways that we can think beyond what we're thinking right now. And patients are the ones that can actually have those insights. I really love that. So moving on to the real world, beyond trials, at point of care, let's talk about patient safety there. What are the components of patient safety monitoring in practice? You spoke about reporting, for example. Reporting kind of applies to some extent in trials. I think patients involved in trials are educated a bit about how they need to report. Mm-hmm. I don't think that in the real world, people are aware about reporting systems at all, or even side effects and things like that enough. So yeah, maybe just talk us through what safeguards are in place to monitor patient safety and the roles that patients themselves play in protecting themselves when they're on medication.
Well, in my work, we've surveyed patients and it's very mixed. The number one reporting mechanism that came back was telling their healthcare professional. Mm-hmm. So this is happening to me. I took this drug and this is what happened to me. Okay, there's this big kind of gap and I report it to my healthcare professional. Did they report it to the drug company? What happened with that information? I myself have had, side effects and things happen to me. And I've called the 800 number on the label, myself, and I've called the drug manufacturer. But again, that takes a lot of guts. I mean, that takes a very well-informed, empowered patient to call a big pharma to say, I have this. And then what do you say to the big pharma company? What are you going to do with this information? Well, no, you're not going to say that, But what do they do with that information? And like I said, it comes back to this feedback loop. I took the time out of my schedule, and it took a lot for me to do that. What did you do with that information? And again, in my humble opinion, I have not seen a process or a system in place, a universally used template or a universally used process that reports it back to the patient. I haven't seen that. So I think that the three of us have to come up with something to do that. But I want to just talk about future looking things that I think that could help. I think that wearables and sensors, remote patient monitoring, and AI can play a huge part in all of this. So let's talk about wearables and sensors. Everybody, has an iWatch, an Apple Watch. I don't want to promote Apple, but
some sort of fitness tracker, essentially.
Fitness tracker. There we go.
Yeah, although if Apple want to sponsor this episode, we can.
Exactly. Apple, talk to my friends. Thank you. But, so everybody kind of has those types of wearables and things like that. So how can that pick up a signal that is going to collect indicators that's going to lead to an event? So this is where AI comes into play, that AI can detect a certain pattern of events. Maybe it's loss of sleep, maybe it's a certain tremor pattern, things that this can pick up and is going to lead to an event and can head it off at the pass, can prevent it. You know what I mean? I think there's real potential for that. And so much of what happens to patients happens between the visits, right? Mm-hmm. Visits are just an episodic part in time. And so much of that data and so much of that life happens between the visits. And how are we capturing that before we even get there? So as far as reporting, like I said, I think we have 800 numbers. We have telling your healthcare professional, and I would like to see more patient engagement mechanisms, maybe an app, things like that, a universal app. I don't know. But again, the whole reason that I'm here today is because I don't think enough's being done. I really don't think enough's
Yeah.
being done. And I think there's a huge gap. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that reporting and all of this is from the patient end. And I agree that there is a lot to be done. Also, in terms of education, like I said, I don't think that patients understand the concept. I mean, certainly not all over the world, certainly not where I'm from. I live in India. I don't think patients understand side effects or adverse events or the fact that they need to necessarily even tell their GP. I'll tell you an example. So a patient is seeing a psychiatrist and is on psychiatric medication and started developing urinary tract infections and would not even think of mentioning them to the psychiatrist, right? But those are known side effects of the psychiatric medication. And they would not tell their GP because mental health is taboo and the GP doesn't know that they're seeing the psychiatrist and that kind of thing. So there's a lot to be done, I think, definitely in terms of reporting from the patient side. But I want to take a step back and, again, for the sake of our audience, explain from the pharma side how the process works in terms of the expectation, what happens when this data is reported. When they put out those things on drug leaflets saying, call this in if you experience something, who is there taking those calls and what does that system look like at the pharma end?
I mean, I did not work for a pharmaceutical company in drug development. I've only worked for a CRO. Now, however, I was a pharmaceutical rep way back in the day when dinosaurs roamed the earth, and I sold a drug. And unfortunately, that drug was pulled from the market, and it was because of deaths from the medication. And I'm not really sure. I don't want to speak to the details of the why or whatever. I can just tell you that as a drug rep, we were told that there were reported deaths from the medication and the drug was pulled from the market. So, I don't want to speculate what happened there, but it makes me super sad. It makes me sad, first of all, for the victims who died and their families. So I want to just say, number one, those who passed. And number two, for those who were using the drug and it was working for them. So it was really sad for the people that it was working for, that they didn't have access to that medication anymore. But that's inevitably what happens. A drug is pulled from the market, which is just terrible for all involved. I can't imagine the pain of those families. Could you imagine that they took this drug and their loved one died and they had to report that? Oh my goodness. I just can't even imagine that pain.
Yeah.
And can you imagine the courage that it took to report that? So that's the worst case scenario.
Thanks for sharing that.
It's interesting though, it just based on our conversation earlier, obviously that's the absolute worst thing that could happen to a person, you say, but I would think it would be more likely that someone would report something like that because they'd want to make sure it didn't happen to someone else and want to know what happened, want to know what caused it. And also from a clinical side as well, they would know about the death and they would report that and say it might have been caused by this drug. So actually, in a way, that raises bigger alarm bells. The reporting is probably the highest it'll be for that kind of, it feels silly to call it an adverse event, but that's what it is. And likewise, things like, scary things like heart murmur or jaundice or things that are really visible and alarming, you'd go to your doctor. If it's things like headache, diarrhea, that kind of thing, maybe the reporting isn't as close to what's happening in the real world.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. That's where I'm hoping, like I said, that AI, increased investment, increased education of patients and healthcare providers, increased leadership, supporting a safe environment to report, all of those things can help us in the future. It's a lot of education, communication, trust, breaking down stigma, breaking down fear, things like that.
Yeah.
It's a lot of that.
I want to pick up on something that you said about research that your organization has done, where there's a large gap between patients reporting and then ACPs reporting back to the companies, for example. So, what would you say is the expected role division between a doctor and a patient in identifying and acting on safety concerns?
Great question. I would say it's a team effort. And this kind of goes to my whole pillar of shared decision making. I'm old, right? I'm 55, which I'm proud to say since I'm a stage 4 cancer survivor. I never have problems saying my age.
Also,
But,
that isn't old, Stacy.
I've just begun. I've really just begun. But I'm fortunate in that I've been in healthcare, for 30 years, and I've seen the evolution of it going from adversarial to hopefully more collaborative and more of a team effort. And why is that? Well, that's because of the internet. And, I'm talking to my people here on not just patients. And people always ask me, when do you think that shift happened? And it happened in COVID. That was when it was in its heyday. And we were all out on Twitter. I think that's probably how I got connected with you. I was really one of the louder voices on Twitter and getting involved in the conversation. And it was this level playing field between healthcare professionals and patients. And you could access doctors by tweeting them and answer you back. It was so empowering. It was great, and it was like, yes, the rise up patients. Let's go. Twitter obviously changed in its own fashion, and that kind of fell down or went away or whatever it did. And we kind of lost that. And I haven't really seen anything to replace that, where you have that equal playing field in real time that you can ask a doctor a question and they'll respond to you. It's like, oh my gosh, Dr. Smith just responded to me. This is amazing. And we need something like that in real time in patient safety at point that it happens, that you can click on it or communicate that this is happening to me. What do I do now? That's why I think it was so empowering. The Cures Act enabled our results, our patient tests, to be released to us real time in our patient portals. 7 large organizations opposed that, which I think one of them was the AMA. Okay. Well, why is that? Because patients are getting their test results before doctors have the chance to explain them to them. So it's a really double-edged sword, right? Because we have access to this information, which we wanted, but yet there wasn't the infrastructure there to interpret it. And I'll give you my own example. I mean, I'm followed for my treatment, and I had a scan done or I had a test done and something came back and it said inflammation or something like this. Well, I panicked. I was like, oh my gosh, do I have a recurrence? What is happening to me? What is going on? And here, when I did my visit with my oncologist, it was scar tissue. It lit up on the scan because it was scar tissue. So here I was freaking out, all this anxiety, all of this that I put myself through for no reason, when a trained professional told me, no, that's nothing. So that's why we need this teamwork. That's why we need this increased patient navigation and increased support to interpret these results so that patients aren't freaking out when they get them and they think that they're at risk and they're unsafe, when we have the expertise of a healthcare professional explaining that to us. That's why it really needs to be a team effort. It is a total team effort between patients and healthcare professionals and physicians.
Just off the back of that, I think what is interesting is often when you are given treatment options in a shared decision-making capacity, so either a procedure or an intervention, a treatment, a therapy, I think one of the scariest things is talking about the potential side effects and adverse events. I remember this situation once, actually, when Clarinda and I did our U-Party training, where we all opened up that massive leaflet, the one with the tiny writing that folds out. And it lists all of the possible adverse events and side effects that you could possibly ever have. That's really scary if you don't know what it means and you don't really have context of, is that likely to happen to you? What are the things that I should be looking out for? When should I call my doctor? When should I be concerned? And I think the kind of standard regulated little leaflet that's in there from a sort of compliance perspective is not patient friendly at all. And therefore you do need that two-way conversation with the doctor to say, what are the risk benefits here? And actually, without that conversation, I don't think anyone would ever take any drug looking at that list of side effects. So it really is that two-way understanding. And I think sometimes it can almost be dismissed. I know they will look at safety and tolerability, but quite often we're looking at like the efficacy. Does it work? Does it improve your life? Whereas actually the scariest thing I personally think from a patient perspective is, what is this drug that's new that I'm coming on going to do to me? What impact is it going to have on my health, on my quality of life? What should I expect? What should I be concerned about or not? And maybe that's me as a highly anxious person, but I think there's a lot more weight to it from a patient perspective than maybe looking at it from sort of an academic perspective. And again, that brings in the whole element of, we need to have patients involved in these conversations. We need to have patients involved in creating educational materials for when other people start.
Yeah.
We need patients involved in reviewing a regulatory and a HTA perspective to say these side effects and safety concerns are acceptable versus the benefits or not.
I'm all for plain language summaries or patient information leaflets.
Same. That's a standard operating procedure for our trials and our patient engagement team for our company. Lay patient summaries are a requirement on every single trial.
Yeah.
Bar none. Hard stop. Because I'm here. But don't get me started, Caitlin, on informed consent. Don't get me started. All it is, you know me, I'm blunt. It's legalese. Okay. It's legalese, but it falls way short of truly informing patients, of understanding the risks, knowing when to report symptoms, understanding prohibited medications or activities, what to do in an emergency. Those are the need to knows for patients. So you need the informed consent. Yes, you do. You need a companion patient education material to say, this is what you're really getting into. Because you look at all of the Tufts and CISScript data, and you look at all the motivations for why patients do and don't enroll in clinical research. And one of consistently the top 5 is not understanding fully what they're getting into, and dropout rate, in addition to travel to the site, duration of the procedures, invasiveness of the procedures, side effects of the investigational treatment. I mean, it burns me up. To me, being a cancer survivor, when you're going through cancer, so much is happening to you every single day. And this really gets right back to patient safety. From the chemo, my skin was cracking. I'm looking at my fingers because my skin was cracking. They were bleeding and cracking. My gums were inflamed. I had mouth sores. I still have neuropathy. I had constipation from the various medications. I had diarrhea. I reported every single one to my nurse.
Wow.
Every single one, and my hair was thinning. My hair didn't fall out completely, but my hair was thinning. My vision was changing. I had muscle weakness. I had bone pain. I had muscle pain. I told my nurse every single one of them. She was probably like, oh my gosh, I can't take it. Shut up. But I did, because I didn't know. And I wasn't even in a trial. This is from just standard of care chemotherapy. Yeah. And I was telling her every single thing that was happening to me. So my point is that when you're going through an illness and you're going through medication, so much is out of your control. So much. And these elements about informing the patient and letting them know what's going to happen to them, informing them of the risk, are things that are within our control. Let's control the things that we can when we know so much is happening to a patient that's out of our control. Let's control the things that we can for them. It's the least we can do.
Yeah, I can relate as well. I think that there have been times when I've been on so many different medication cocktails, and I've similarly reported every single thing. And it feels like, I don't know, I wake up every day and I'm like, okay, which of my symptoms is worse today? And is it something in my head or is it something in my feet? And which one am I going to complain about today specifically and report and mention? But I think that it also takes some amount of tenacity, because there is this sense of you not wanting to be complaining all the time.
Right.
As a patient, you don't want to be that patient who's
not. Well, this is what I said. And to my dear deceased friend's point, if I'm a complainer, am I going to get kicked out of the trial? She's a problem. She's going to get kicked out of the trial. Or, especially in colon cancer, colorectal cancer, what we hear a lot is this being dismissed, especially, and here I get on my colorectal cancer advocacy stump, is, this is happening more and more in young people. I mean, it is the leading cause of death in people under 50 now. Okay. That's the statistic. And so you have young people coming to their doctor and saying, something's not right here. My bowel habits, I have pain, this and that. Oh, you're too young for that. You're too young. Take some Miralax. You're probably change your diet, this, that. And they're dismissed when there should be sent for a colonoscopy or screened for colorectal cancer because we're seeing this happen. But you could just take that same model and apply it across the board. Just patients just flat out dismissed. And I don't even want to get into, quote, white and privileged, right? People of color, people in other cultures, that they are not empowered to speak up for themselves, that's not the accepted norm. Like I said, every time I've gone through cancer and gone through caregiving for my son with a rare disease, I think of, I am white, I have resources, I have worked in healthcare for 30 years. I'm really in the top, probably 1% of informed, empowered patients. What does everybody else do? What does everybody else do? And that's who we need to fight for. That's who we need to give a voice to. And that's who we need to empower to report and feel safe to report safety concerns.
Yeah.
Completely agree. And I think about this a lot. And actually during this conversation, even more so thinking, I've not done what you've done, Stacy, and called up a pharmaceutical company, or even in the UK, we have MHRA yellow card scheme, which is really great. And anyone can go online and report any adverse event from any drug, and that'll be recorded centrally. It's such a great system. I've never used it. I'm sure many other people aren't even aware it exists or haven't used it either. So it seems like a really big barrier is just this empowerment, information, knowledge, and then also the fear of what will happen with it. It is to help, it is to keep patients safe. But, if I'm on a drug that's changed my life from a health perspective, what's the risk of it getting taken off the market if I report a headache, for example?
Right.
And then absolutely, like you say, that's, again, me in the UK, incredibly educated and knowledgeable about this system. And what does that mean for everyone else? And I think that's really difficult. And it's why certain communities aren't as involved in clinical trials as they should be, which causes a safety concern, because then that drug goes into the real world and it is being used by those communities and populations. And there's no data on that yet. So then it's relying on real world data. And sometimes that doesn't come through quick enough because people aren't reporting it. So it's sad and scary, but I think there are great initiatives that are being done. And just to put that positive spin on it, if we could talk about, now that we sort of covered the challenges and the need and the value, do you have any kind of examples, initiatives you can share of how we can actually overcome this and what's being done to improve this situation?
Yeah, you summarized the entire podcast so nicely, Caitlin, but I really think that that's an action for all of us to take away from this is, what are the next steps? And I don't know what those are. I also, before I came to my current role at Parexel, I was a patient advocate for the Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine, SITM. And we were doing some great work there. And I unfortunately don't think that work's continued. As far as I understand it, I think that work's gone away. So that again shows you that there's a gap. So I'll be honest with you. Like I said, I admit I'm not a patient safety expert. I just am a person who is a problem solver, and I see where gaps exist and I see where we can make process improvements. So I think number one action for all of us to take away from this podcast is just what you said about the MHRA reporting. I admittedly was not aware of that. So let's get out there with your following and all of our audience here today, and let's raise awareness of those resources. And I myself am going to take it on me to go back and research even more to see what reporting mechanisms are available here in the US, in the UK, in the other countries we serve, in APAC, et cetera. So admittedly, I'm going to do a deeper dive and check those out, and let's raise awareness of those. And if they don't exist, let's create them, because from what I've seen, there's not enough. There's the standard telephone numbers. I know that the pharmaceutical companies, they do a great job on their websites. I've gone and I've looked at a ton of them, and they have beautiful patient portals to report, adverse events from drugs. But again, that's assuming comfort with technology. That's assuming internet connectivity and things like that. You know, if you're on the internet, if you're internet savvy, et cetera. But I do think that we could have more of standardized global effort here. So I think that's the action to take away from today, is to investigate what those are. Let's raise awareness of them. And if they don't exist, let's create them together, really.
Yeah. I think that's a great call to action almost to end this episode on. And I think that it's worth acknowledging as well some of the work that's happening, for example, with plain language summaries of even things like informed consent forms, for example, like that your organization does, and quite a few others, I think, do. At least in clinical trials, there is more of an emphasis on involving patients. Maybe not specifically from a safety angle, but there is clearly a need for that. And hopefully we see more of that as well.
I think as well, it's not specifically initiative, but at least from my awareness in the UK, and I think worldwide, what is also really good is that the pharmaceutical industry, it's strictly regulated in terms of reporting on safety issues. So once they become aware of it through conversations or come across it online, or even from things like family members, I know that during COVID, it was a complete nightmare with everyone talking about vaccines, and you had to sort of report anything you heard about vaccines when everyone you know had one. But to a certain extent, you know, that's a really good system in place because you have to, by law, report it. And I work for a healthcare communications agency. And if we find out about any of our clients' products, we have to report that into their drug safety department. So I think that's a really good and powerful system to ensure that actually, if as a company you do find out that your product has had an adverse event, or there's been a product complaint, or there's been unintentional exposure, you have to report that, which is really great. I think the only kind of issue with that is that the pharmaceutical company aren't necessarily people on the ground. So they're not going to be the people that patients go to talk about this. They're not necessarily going to hear from the doctors. So while that system's really good and in place, there's again that gap between real world clinical practice and what the companies are hearing about.
Well, I always say, I've been trying to bring it into the mainstream, is we talk about translational medicine is bench to bedside, but translational medicine should also be bedside to bench. And again, it's that feedback, you know, bench to bedside, because when you get to the bedside, those are patients. That's us. Okay. That's the real world. That's the consumers. That's the users. Okay. How do we translate our lived experience? And everybody knows Stacy, big lived experience person, you know, how do we translate our lived experience back into making the drug development process better? Because that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where patients' lived experience can most impact the process from the very beginning, back to the bench, back to our researchers, back to our scientists to make this better for all of us. And so that's where I think that we have the most potential right now. And especially 80% of Americans are going out to the internet before they even talk to a doctor. 80%
Absolutely.
used to be Dr. Google. Now it's ChatGPT. So we even talk about that. You know, you're taking your symptoms and you're putting them in ChatGPT. I mean, there are patients taking they get a diagnosis, they're getting their results in their portal. They're taking that, they're dumping it in ChatGPT, and they're asking it, what should I do? And they're doing the same thing. I'm having these symptoms. What do I do? That's the reality. And I keep preaching that on every panel I'm on too, that we need to address this because it's happening. Okay. I sit on webinars where they tell patients to do this. And I'm like, wait a minute. No. You know, so with that happening, how do we again keep up with that with the guardrails of human in the loop, physician expertise in the loop to guide that and make sure that it goes where it's supposed to go?
Yeah. That's so important.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stacy. This has been really, really enlightening, and all your heart and passion comes out in everything you say. We've loved hearing your story. We've loved hearing your journey and all the advice that you've had to give. It means a lot to have had you here. I think just to end, would you like to share your long-term dream for patient safety?
Well, my long-term dream for patient safety, I think it's come through pretty clear, is my long-term dream for patient involvement. And that is that patients are equitable stakeholders in the entire drug development ecosystem. This is the biggest and best opportunity that I've seen in my lifetime for patients to contribute to research and drug development. And I want every patient to have the same chance to beat cancer that I did. I want every patient to have the same voice that I have at Parexel and in the wider landscape of, having a platform for positive change. I want every patient to feel safe and empowered to speak up without fear of backlash, without fear of being kicked out of a trial, without fear of some larger force suppressing them or dismissing them. And like I said, I just feel like we're on the verge of the best opportunity in healthcare for patients to contribute. And I want them to have that chance. That's what I live for every single day. I mean, that's why I survived cancer. This is my destiny. I mean, I want to bring all of our voices right to the table, right to the forefront and have a say. That's it.
That's an amazing dream. And yeah, I think we can both agree and everyone listening, I'm sure, will aspire to that totally. And it's everything that this podcast is about as well. So it's a lovely note to end on, to get patients involved and have that seat at the table. So thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about this today and really making it come to life. And I'm really excited to share this so that more people can actually learn about this aspect that maybe they're not even aware of, because I think education is a big barrier. So thanks so much for sharing that with us and for all of your advice and your stories too.
Yeah, and I'll share a little secret. For the longest time, we've had patient safety as one of the topics on our list. And because we've associated patient safety with pharmacovigilance, we've thought oh my God, this is going to be one of those super heavy topics. So we've kind of always put it on the back burner. But then I saw one of your posts about it and I was like, yes, she's the perfect person.
Aww.
And it's not going to be boring at all. It's going to be super interesting. And that's exactly what it turned out to be. So we're really glad we bumped it up and we're really glad we got this done. Thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you to both of you for what you're doing and amplifying patient voices. I want to thank all of the patient advocates out there in the audience. I see you. I see what you're doing. I appreciate you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much. Keep going. I'm one of us. I will always be one of us. I'm not some pharma executive. I will always be, first and foremost, a patient, a caregiver, a survivor, a thriver. So always, that's who I am at my core. So thank you both. Thank you, audience. Let's keep going. And yes, I do like to break down complicated topics and just make them relatable. That's what I love to do.
So, Caitlin, on the back of that conversation with Stacy, I was wondering if we could just talk about some of our key highlights and takeaways.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess firstly, it was really interesting to think about how broad patient safety actually is and the different sort of contexts where it becomes applicable. So Stacy spoke about the World Health Organization definition of safety, which is the reduction of risk of unnecessary harm associated with healthcare to an acceptable minimum, whatever that happens to be. But to bring that into real world context, it's basically how can we protect patients as possible and reduce harm? And that could be in many different contexts, right? And Stacy shared those with us as well. So whether it's in clinical research and clinical trials, which is more robust and regimented and tracked, versus whether it's once a product or a drug has come into the system and people are using it in their day-to-day lives, or whether it's even just within the healthcare system. So Stacy spoke to a diagnosis error and a surgical error, a daily management piece, basically. And I mean, I think we can talk about the official definitions as much as possible, but the real human experience is that essentially when you're in the healthcare system, you're looking to improve your health and reduce that risk and make sure that you feel and are as safe as you possibly can be.
Yeah, I agree. And what's interesting is that while there might be a WHO definition or patient safety experts might agree on a definition, that definition has an inbuilt element of minimum acceptable risk. And that is very subjective. It completely depends on individuals'
where they are in their state of life, disease area, etc., etc. What is acceptable to you is not acceptable to me.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so important to involve patients in defining what is an acceptable risk, whether that be in clinical trials or at point of care, having those conversations with patients to define safety and what is a good risk benefit ratio, I think is extremely important, rather than leaving patients to figure out side effects and whether this is a serious one or not, whether this is something that I should bring up with my doctor or not,
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that kind of follows on what we spoke about in terms of lack of reporting or lack of understanding about reporting. And what struck me is that a lot of that stems from, I think, a bit of fear of the unknown. So patients worry about what should I or should I not report. And I think what's most striking and speaks to that risk benefit that you spoke about is that patients are worried sometimes to report side effects in case they are kicked out of the trial or in case the drug they're using is taken off the market, when they actually perceive that those side effects aren't that bad or are worth it for the benefit.
Yeah.
And that's what people can decide on an individual level. But I guess there's a worry that if they report it, then they might have a wider impact on the wider patient community and themselves, which you might not want to do for a headache, but you would want to do if, for example, it was causing some really severe side effects, up to and including death. That's the most serious. But there's also fear from, I think, the other side as well. From a doctor's perspective, in the current day and age, I think a lot of doctors might be worried about getting sued for malpractice if something goes wrong, or again, they don't want to get into trouble or reprimanded for anything as well. And from a pharmaceutical side, while there are really strict reporting regulations there, they would fear about reporting safety issues in case their product was no longer on the market, if it was taken off. So from different angles, there are worries and concerns about safety reporting. And I think some of that comes from the fact that people just don't know what their report is going to trigger.
Yeah.
There's no feedback loop. And there's a bit of a lack of understanding about why and how it's so important to report these things.
Yeah. And I don't think we got answers to all questions in this episode. And I think that leaves room for more education. And that's so important. Like you said, people need to know that these reporting systems exist. They need to know why they exist, what the benefit is, and what happens on the other end when they report something. And I think that there are so many really passionate patient safety advocates who are doing great work, and their message just needs to become louder, stronger, and essentially more people really need to understand that these systems and processes actually exist for the benefit of patients.
Yeah, totally agree.
Thanks so much for listening. This has been Not Just Patient with our guests, Stacy Hurt, and your hosts, Caitlin Rich and Clarinda Surejo.